Children, we know that the good God, he always stays exactly the same. But what we also know is that man is constantly changing in many different ways. And sometimes God sees as man changes, he needs different things for his ultimate benefit, so that he can save his soul and as many people as can be saved as possible, and as much good can be done for his church. St. Francis' life and his calling, this is a perfect example of just this. He was born a young man in Assisi in Italy, and he grew up very fortunate. His father was a very wealthy man, had a lot of money, and was very successful in dealing with mercantiles, basically cloths and clothing and things like that he dealt with, and he made a lot of money in that, and he taught Francis the trade as well, and Francis became very good at doing all of that. He became just as successful as his father, and they were good partners together. His father loved him more than anybody else on earth. And while being a pious young man, he wasn't faithless. In fact, he did a lot of good and practiced a lot of virtue. Still, the trappings of being wealthy in the world were something that easily fell upon Francis. He loved having money. He loved wearing the finest of clothing, eating the best of foods, and partying and having a good time with his friends as often as possible. And so, even these things, though, they began to have a little bit of lacking of satisfaction in his mind. And so he and his friends were at a pub one night, and they were talking, and they decided it was time for them, as young men often would think, to have a little bit of adventure. And there was a war going on, and they decided to join up with the army and head off and to find that adventure in battle. But this is when the first bits of change came to Francis. For the first time, he was walking down a street one time, and now he has all these thoughts about being a soldier in his head, and he happens to come and meet an old soldier, a man who had been in previous wars. And these wars had left him poor and destitute, and he wore rags for clothing. In talking to the man, he got to realize that he was a good man who had done much in fighting, and yet he had nothing. Francis was moved by this, and he took the clothes off of his own back and traded him, took his poor clothes and gave him the real nice, fine clothes and sent him on his way as a nice act of charity. But still, he got ready for battle with his friends, and he went out and spent a whole bunch of money on all of his kit for this, bought the nicest of swords, beautiful chainmail, a wonderful horse, all these things, and soon it was time for them to set out and travel to where the battle was going to take place. Along the way, Francis got sick, very sick, had a fever, was laid up in bed, and at this point, they didn't know what else to do with him. They had to continue on to battle, and so it was time for him to sort of be left behind, and either he could recover and catch back up with them later on, or he could find help and return home. That night, while he was in bed, sick, he heard a voice come to him, a voice from heaven, and asked him, "Francis, whom does it profit to follow, the servant or the master?" And Francis answered, he said, "Well, of course, the master." And the voice then said to him, "Why do you abandon the master then for the servant? Return to your home country." And with that, Francis knew what he had to do. He got up the next day, he felt a bit better, and instead of following after his fellow soldiers, he returned back to Assisi. Yet he didn't really know what he was to do. He just knew he had to go back, and he knew that the master that was being spoken of had to be somebody greater than the will of the generals and things like that. And so he likened it to probably be God as the true master. And so he prayed. He began to pray in all earnestness for guidance, all the while still falling back into his old ways, going out and drinking and eating with his friends, having a good time and partying. And yet he found these things to be even more unsatisfying to him. It just didn't fill him up with anything substantial. And so he began to pray and sacrifice more and more. People began to notice in him that he became thinner and paler, and they wouldn't see him at certain events and things like that. And he started doing more acts of charity, giving up large sums of money, giving off clothes to people. He started seeing his own faults even in it, realized that while he had no problem being generous and giving of himself to the poor, one of the things that he really struggled with was lepers. He found them to be very much repulsive and didn't want to be near them. He was afraid of them. And so he conquered himself by forcing himself to go and be with the lepers at times. Excuse me. One day, he came across a little chapel called San Damiano, and it was in ruins. It was really falling apart really badly. And he was praying there in front of the crucifix, and he heard a voice again, and it told him to rebuild my house. St. Francis was like Saul in the desert, though. He had no idea what the voice meant by this, and he took it to be literal. This church needed to be rebuilt. How was he going to do that? Well, Francis had an idea. He returned back to his father's shop, and in the middle of the night, he gathered up a whole bunch of the linens and the materials for clothes, and he went off the next day, and he sold them at the market, and he made a bunch of money selling these things, and he came back with all of that money, and he brought it to the priest of the church, and said, "Here, you need to rebuild the church, and here's the money to do it." The priest was astounded. "Where did you come up with so much money to give to us to be able to rebuild the church?" And so Francis told him, "I sold these things from my father's shop, etc., etc." And the priest flatly refused. "I cannot take the money at all." "Well, how come?" "Because you didn't come by it honestly. That's not your money, that's your father's money. That was his textiles that you sold. You can't do that, that's stealing." And Francis, now he was afraid, because what was he going to do with the money? He hid it and asked the man, he said, "Oh, my dad's going to be really mad at me. Can I just stay here and pray for a while?" And the priest had pity on him and let him stay, but refused the money. After a couple days, the father came in, realizing what Francis had done. He came in all super angry and grabbed Francis out of the church and dragged him back home and put him under lock and chain. Extraordinarily in a rage, he beat him and chained him up in his own house. One day, though, while he went out to the market to sell goods, his mother came in and had pity on him and unchained him, but told him, he said, "You can go free, but you can't come back to this home. Your father will have none of it." And so Francis went back to San Damiano, and at which, when the father came home, he saw his son missing, and he was even more enraged. And he went out and found St. Francis, and St. Francis at this point had prayed and had gained enough strength that he was going to face his father and do the right thing. And so he came out, and the father demanded that he, instead of hearing Francis out and letting him make what was wrong, he dragged him before the bishop and took him to what was to court. The bishop was acting as the judge at that time. He took him to his own son to court and demanded that he repay everything that he stole. And the bishop looked at him and said, "Francis, you can't keep this money because you didn't get it by the right way. It's not yours." And Francis said, "I know, and I will repay the money." And the father demanded, "That's right, everything that you have that is mine, you must give back to me." At that, Francis said, "Fine." And he took the money and he gave it to his father, and then before him, he took off everything that he had on as his clothing. He said, "All of this you gave to me too. And so unless you come after me later on in life and ask for anything in return, I give you everything you've ever given to me back." The father could have apologized for being unruly, but he was so mad he just took all of the possessions and returned home, and they never spoke again. The bishop, seeing the sincerity of St. Francis, wrapped him in his own cloak and sent him on his way after embracing him. Francis went to San Damiano, and he repaired it by his own hands, digging out stones from the ground, and one by one breaking them up and shaping them and placing them in place. And then while he was doing this, the priest, who was poor but saw the man working hard, gave him a nice meal, knowing that Francis is accustomed to eating good things. Francis looked at the plate and he said, "I can't do this. You're a poor priest and you give me fine food." And so he gave the priest the food back, and he went out on his own, and he went from door to door and he begged for scraps. And he came back with all these little bits of food that people would have thrown away or given to paupers, poor people, beggars on the streets. And he ate that instead. And this would be his new way of doing things. You'd only get what he could beg for each day. Soon, with his piety and his poverty, he gained a few followers who wanted to live like him. And they repaired 2 more churches in the time that they were doing this. And finally, it became time that Francis realized with these few followers that he had, he needed approval for his rule. He drew up a simple little rule of life, and he went to Rome and to Innocent III. Innocent was bothered by this rough-looking man in coarse garbs coming to him, so he dismissed him. But that night he had a dream that a man clothed just like St. Francis, looking just like St. Francis, would come, and another man who would later be known to be St. Dominic, and each of them were pillars holding up the church. And so he invited Francis back, and he heard his rule, and the only objection he had was to the level of poverty that Francis wanted. Francis wanted to have nothing whatsoever, and that every day they had to rely on divine providence for their daily sustenance. They had to beg for it. And he said, "This is too hard. You can't live by this." And Francis said, "Of course we can, because if we were to own even food, in today's day and age, we need to own arms in order to defend it from others." And with that, the Pope knew he was right and gave him the blessing of his rule, and they went off. Why do you think that God called St. Francis to such a hard life and make such a stark turn? Well, because he needed something like that to do good for a massive amount of souls. At that time, the church had been established all throughout Europe, and there were many monasteries who lived by religious rules. But you had a lot of poor people who looked at the monasteries and realized that they, by embracing the religious life, they lived a better life than some of the poor did on the streets. And it was a temptation, not that the monasteries were bad and living that way, but it was a temptation in some people's minds that they might not be as sincere as they would be. And so they weren't listening as closely to the words coming from those priests' mouths. And so it took a rich man to give up everything in order to preach the ideas of the true God and the true faith, and to get people to come back to repentance, and to get them to sacrifice it, to be charitable. They took the extreme example to do what was necessary to show a true sincerity. People dismissed this once very popular man as crazy. People thought that he had lost his marbles. Some people thought that they saw in him as a true saint. But nobody could deny how sincere he was. And soon he gained more and more people coming to hear the words he spoke, the truth that he taught, the faith that he espoused, and the life that he lived. And so it's a good lesson for all of you. Remember, when you pray to God to one day let you know what your vocation in life is, it's going to require at some point in time, no matter what it is going to be, a little bit of change, a little bit of sacrifice, and a little bit of getting out of your own comfort area. But that's okay, because God uses that to do good. He wants you to give of yourself and be selfless, no matter what he calls you to do what is his will above all else. And he uses that good example to inspire other people too. May God bless you in the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Ghost.